There is a piece of evidence that has been sitting in a laboratory storage facility in Colorado for almost 30 years. It was collected in the earliest days of one of the most famous investigations in American criminal history. It was analyzed, debated, argued over, used to exonerate a family, and then left in a kind of investigative limbo for decades while the world moved on to other stories, other cases, other tragedies. It never went away. It never degraded beyond usefulness. It never stopped pointing in a specific direction that the investigation, for years, chose not to follow with the urgency the evidence itself deserved. And now, in 2026, that piece of evidence, a genetic profile from an unknown male found on 2 separate items of clothing belonging to a child who died on Christmas night in 1996, has led investigators somewhere they have never been before in this case. Somewhere specific, somewhere real. Somewhere that for the first time in nearly 3 decades has people close to the investigation speaking carefully about possibilities that once seemed impossibly distant. This is the story of that DNA evidence. Not just what it is, but what it means, why it was ignored for as long as it was, what happened when the technology finally caught up to what the evidence was always trying to say, and where the investigation stands today as a result of applying methods that didn't exist when JonBenét Ramsey was found on the morning of December 26, 1996. It is a story about science and about time and about what happens when an investigation becomes so committed to one theory that it takes decades to properly examine the evidence pointing in another direction. And it is a story that, as of the moment you are watching this, has not yet reached its conclusion, but may be closer to one than at any previous point in its long and painful history. Before we go further into the evidence and what it has produced, if you are new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. At True Crime Vault, we approach these cases the way they deserve to be approached, through the evidence, through the science, through the documented facts of what investigators actually found and what that evidence actually establishes. We do not speculate beyond what the record supports. We do not make promises about solved cases when no charges have been filed. And we do not treat real people, real families, and real tragedies as entertainment to be sensationalized. If that approach to true crime is what you are looking for, this channel is for you. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on where this case is heading, and let us get into the evidence that has defined this investigation for 3 decades and what it may finally be about to tell us. The first thing you need to understand about the DNA evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case is that its existence was not a secret. It was not hidden from investigators for years while they chased other theories. It was not discovered late in the investigation by some breakthrough researcher who found something everyone else had missed. The DNA was identified in 1997, within the first year of the investigation, by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, whose forensic scientists processed physical evidence collected from the crime scene and from JonBenét herself. The report they produced was delivered to Boulder police within 2 weeks of the child being found. 2 weeks. The science had already produced a finding pointing away from the Ramsey family before most people outside of Boulder had even heard the name JonBenét Ramsey. What the Colorado Bureau of Investigation found was genetic material from an unknown male on items of clothing JonBenét had been wearing. This DNA did not match John Ramsey. It did not match Patsy Ramsey. It did not match Burke Ramsey. It did not match any of the Ramsey children from John's first marriage. It did not match any of the family friends who had been in the house that morning and who provided samples for comparison. The profile belonged to someone whose identity was completely unknown to the investigation, whose connection to the child and to what had happened inside the Ramsey home on Christmas night was entirely unestablished. That finding was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. CODIS is a tiered national database that contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders, from crime scene evidence in unsolved cases, and from other sources. When an unknown crime scene profile is entered, the system automatically searches it against every profile in the database looking for a match. If the unknown person has ever been convicted of an offense requiring DNA collection in any jurisdiction that participates in the system, their profile would already be in the database and the match would be found. No match was found in 1997. The unknown male was not in the system. He was not a convicted offender with a recorded profile. The evidence pointed towards someone who had never been entered into the criminal database, which itself carried implications about who this person might be. What happened next is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of this investigation. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation report, the one containing findings that pointed away from the Ramsey family within 14 days, was not shared with the Boulder District Attorney's Office for 7 months. 7 months during which the investigation continued to focus its primary attention on the family. 7 months during which public suspicion about John and Patsy Ramsey hardened into a narrative that millions of people absorbed and accepted as established truth. 7 months during which the investigators running the case possessed scientific evidence that directly complicated their primary theory and chose, for reasons that have never been fully explained publicly, not to share it with the prosecutors who were supposed to be evaluating the case. When this timeline became public knowledge years later, the reaction from legal professionals and former law enforcement officials was not mild. Former Deputy District Attorney Trip DeMuth acknowledged publicly that as of January 15, 1997, just 2 weeks after JonBenét was found, the DNA results had already provided what he described as a strong suggestion that the Ramseys were not responsible for their daughter's death. A strong suggestion, established within 2 weeks, withheld for 7 months. The implications of that timeline for everything that followed, for how the investigation developed, for how the Ramsey family was treated by law enforcement and by the public, for what leads were not pursued while resources remained focused on the family, cannot be overstated. John Ramsey's response to learning that investigators had theorized the unknown genetic material might have come from a factory worker during the manufacturing process of the clothing in China was visceral and immediate. He said he was rolling on the floor when he heard it. He called it the most absurd explanation he had ever encountered. And what his reaction captured, beyond the obvious personal dimension of a father hearing investigators try to explain away evidence that might have pointed toward his daughter's actual killer, was something important about how the investigation had come to function in those years. The manufacturing contamination theory required accepting a chain of events so unlikely, so specific, so difficult to establish as anything more than pure speculation, that its primary function in the investigation seemed to be to allow investigators to continue looking in the direction they had already committed to without being forced to reckon seriously with what the DNA was actually telling them. The manufacturing theory also had a fundamental scientific problem that would become undeniable once additional testing was done. If trace DNA from a factory worker had been deposited on JonBenét's underwear during manufacturing, you would expect it to be isolated, random, and inconsistent with DNA found on other items. You would not expect to find the same profile appearing consistently in multiple locations across multiple garments, which is exactly what happened when investigators applied newer technology to additional items in the evidence collection. In 2003, 6 years after the initial DNA identification, investigators applied a technique called touch DNA to the waistband of the long underwear JonBenét had been wearing over her regular underwear on the night she was found. Touch DNA analysis examines the microscopic residue of skin cells deposited through physical contact with an object. It can identify genetic material left behind simply by someone handling or touching an item, without requiring any more visible or significant biological transfer. The science had advanced dramatically in the years since the original testing, and the new technique could extract genetic information from trace amounts that earlier methods would have missed entirely. The touch DNA analysis of the waistband produced a result that fundamentally changed the evidentiary picture. There was male DNA on the waistband, and it matched the DNA found on the underwear. The same unknown male profile, appearing in 2 separate locations, on 2 separate items of clothing, consistently. The same genetic identity found on the underwear in 1997 was now also present on the waistband of the long johns tested in 2003. 2 different garments, 2 different locations on those garments. The same person's DNA each time. An individual whose identity remained completely unknown to the investigation, but whose biological presence on JonBenét's clothing was now a documented scientific fact, established through 2 independent findings using 2 different testing methodologies across 2 different time periods. This was not what manufacturing contamination looked like. Manufacturing contamination is random, inconsistent, produced by different workers handling different items at different points in a production process. It does not produce the same genetic profile appearing consistently across two separate items of clothing in two separate locations. The two-location finding, the same unknown male present on both garments in a pattern consistent with direct physical contact rather than accidental transfer, is what destroyed the contamination argument for serious forensic analysts who examined the evidence without an existing theory to protect. Former Deputy District Attorney Trip DeMuth was direct about what the two-location finding meant. The probability of innocent manufacturing transfer, producing the same unknown profile on two separate items in two separate locations, he said, was not something that could be reasonably maintained as an explanation once the 2003 results were established. The match across two items and two locations was not consistent with accidental contamination. It was consistent with direct physical contact by the same individual with both garments on the same occasion. Someone who had handled both items of JonBenét's clothing, someone whose genetic material had been found in two places on two garments she had been wearing when she was found, was not in any database, was not a known criminal, was not someone the investigation had identified, was somewhere in the world with a life and a name that the investigation had not yet been able to establish. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey took a step that was by any measure extraordinary in the history of the case. She sent formal letters officially and formally exonerating the entire Ramsey family. The letters stated clearly that the match of the unknown male DNA on two separate items of clothing made it clear that an unknown male had handled those items and that there was no innocent explanation for its presence at two locations on two different items of clothing worn by JonBenét at the time of her passing. Lacey apologized to the Ramsey family. She acknowledged that the investigation had focused too heavily on them and not enough on the possibility that an outside party was responsible. For John Ramsey, that letter arrived 2 years after Patsy had passed away without ever seeing it. She had died in 2006 of ovarian cancer at 49 years old. She had spent a decade being publicly suspected, described in tabloid headlines in terms no grieving mother should have to endure, subjected to the kind of sustained public vilification that few people in American life have had to survive. She had done all of that while grieving a child, while fighting a disease that ultimately took her life, while maintaining consistently and publicly that she had nothing to do with what happened to her daughter and that the investigation needed to be looking somewhere else. She died without vindication. She died without the formal acknowledgement that the science, which had been pointing away from her family since 2 weeks after JonBenét was found, had finally produced. The letter came too late for her. Not everyone accepted the exoneration. The Boulder Police Department publicly disagreed with the scope of Mary Lacey's letter. They argued that the DNA, while significant, was not by itself sufficient to definitively establish that an outside party had been responsible. They pointed out that the amount of genetic material recovered was extremely small. They noted that DNA transfer can occur through mechanisms unrelated to a crime. They observed that the other evidence in the case, the ransom note written on household materials, the specific financial knowledge embedded in the demand, elements pointing toward familiarity with the Ramsey household, had not disappeared simply because an unknown genetic profile had been found. This disagreement reflected a genuine division in how experienced professionals were interpreting the same evidence, and that division defined how the case proceeded for years. What nobody disagreed about was this: the unknown male profile was real. The person behind it was real. Somewhere in the world, there was an individual whose genetic material had been found on JonBenét Ramsey's clothing, whose identity the investigation had not established through 2 decades of conventional database searching, and whose connection to what happened on Christmas night 1996 remained the central unanswered question in the most examined unsolved case in American criminal history. That person existed. The DNA established they existed, and the investigation needed a way to find them that conventional methods had not provided. The way came from an unexpected direction, not from within the law enforcement world, not from a breakthrough in traditional forensic technique, but from millions of ordinary people curious about their ancestry who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to consumer genealogy databases. People who wanted to find cousins, trace their family histories, learn where their ancestors came from. They were not thinking about criminal investigations. But what they created, without intending to, was a resource that changed what was possible in cold case investigation more dramatically than anything since forensic DNA testing itself was developed in the 1980s. Investigative genetic genealogy works through a specific process that requires understanding to appreciate why it represents such a fundamental advance. When an unknown crime scene DNA profile is uploaded to a genealogy database like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, the system searches it against every profile in the database, looking not just for exact matches but for partial matches indicating shared genetic segments. Partial matches indicate family relationships. Even distant relatives, third cousins and fourth cousins who share small segments of DNA inherited from common ancestors several generations back, appear as detectable matches if they have submitted their own profiles to the database. From those distant relative matches, genetic genealogists begin building family trees. They work backward through generations, using birth records and census data and marriage records and all the documentary evidence of family history to trace the lineage of each identified relative back to common ancestors shared with the unknown person. Then they work forward, identifying all the descendants of those ancestors to the present day. That forward work creates a pool of potential candidates, people who are genetically related to the unknown person. From that pool, investigators apply traditional investigative methods to narrow the candidates. Who is the right gender? Who was the right age in 1996? Who lived in or had connections to Boulder at the relevant time? Who cannot account for their whereabouts on Christmas night? Candidate by candidate, the pool narrows until specific individuals emerge as requiring direct investigation. And when those individuals are identified, investigators find ways to obtain their DNA through legal means and compare it directly to the crime scene profile. This technique identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer in April 2018, more than 40 years after he began committing crimes across California. DeAngelo's DNA had been collected from multiple crime scenes across decades. He had never been caught, never convicted of anything that would have put his profile in a criminal database. Genetic genealogy built his family tree from distant relatives who had uploaded their profiles to a consumer database, traced the lineage to him specifically, confirmed his identity through DNA collected from items he discarded in public, and led to his arrest, prosecution, and conviction. The case that had seemed permanently beyond resolution was cracked by science that had not existed when the crimes occurred. In 2021, 25 years after JonBenét was found, Boulder Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation announced publicly that they were applying investigative genetic genealogy to the unknown male DNA profile that had been sitting in the case file since 1997. The unknown profile, which had been entered into CODIS in the late 1990s and had been searched against the database continuously for decades without producing a match, was now being approached through a completely different method. A method that did not require the unknown person to have ever been arrested or convicted. A method that could find them through their relatives even if they themselves had never submitted a genetic sample anywhere. The genealogy work that followed was painstaking and methodical, building family trees from the DNA matches that came back from the database searches, tracing lineages backward through generations, working forward to identify all potential descendants of relevant common ancestors, investigating each viable candidate against the specific circumstances of the Ramsey case. It was the kind of work that takes months, sometimes years, and cannot be rushed without risking errors that could compromise both the investigation and any subsequent prosecution. By 2024, information had emerged from sources familiar with the investigation suggesting that the genealogy work had produced results. Investigators had built family trees from the DNA matches. They had narrowed the pool of potential candidates. And they had identified a person of interest, a specific individual whose genetic profile appeared consistent with the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. A male now in his late 50s to early 60s. A person who had been living in the Boulder area in December of 1996. A person with a documented history of entering homes in Boulder neighborhoods without authorization during that period. A person whose whereabouts on Christmas night, 1996, could not be definitively established. a person with no clear alibi for the critical hours between approximately 10 in the evening on December 25th and 6 in the morning on December 26th. It is essential to be precise about what a person of interest means and what it does not mean. It is not an individual who has been charged with a crime. It does not mean that prosecutors have determined the evidence is sufficient to bring this case to trial. What it means is that investigators have identified someone they need to investigate thoroughly. Someone whose DNA profile requires formal, direct comparison against the crime scene evidence. Someone whose background, history, and whereabouts in December of 1996 are being examined in detail. The identification of a person of interest is a milestone, a significant one in a case that had never previously reached that point. But it is not a resolution. Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redern confirmed in December of 2024 that detectives had collected new evidence and had tested and retested other pieces using evolving DNA technology. The department has maintained a dedicated tip line and has continued to request information from anyone with relevant knowledge. The chief's statement confirmed that solving the case remains a stated top priority for the department under its current leadership. District Attorney Michael Dougherty, whose office would prosecute any charges arising from this investigation, has stated that his office has successfully prosecuted cold case homicides before, and that the age of a case is not by itself a barrier to justice. He has also been clear that DNA evidence alone, however significant, is not sufficient to bring charges that will survive the scrutiny of a criminal trial. More is needed. Additional corroborating evidence, a case built around the DNA that can withstand the challenges that any defense attorney in a case this old will certainly raise. With the person of interest now identified, investigators are re-examining evidence that has been in storage for nearly 3 decades. The unidentified boot print found in the basement area near where JonBenét was discovered is being compared against footwear this individual may have owned in 1996. A palm print found on the wine cellar door is being compared against his palm. His possible connection to the Ramsey home is being examined carefully, whether through the Christmas home tour that brought hundreds of members of the public through the house in the weeks before Christmas, through any professional service he may have provided in the neighborhood, through any social or community overlap with the Ramsey family. People who knew him in 1996 are being located and interviewed. His behavior during that period is being explored through investigative work that goes well beyond the DNA itself. This additional investigative work matters enormously for a specific reason that anyone who understands criminal prosecution needs to appreciate. There is no opportunity for a practice run. There is no second chance if the first attempt fails. Double jeopardy protections mean that if a person is charged, tried, and acquitted, they cannot be tried again for the same offense. An acquittal would close the case permanently. The awareness of that reality, the understanding that the prosecution has to get this right the first time or it will never get another opportunity, is what explains the caution and measured pace of the current work. It is not institutional reluctance or bureaucratic delay. It is the appropriate level of care for a case where the margin for error is exactly 0. The ransom note remains one of the elements that any successful prosecution needs to address in relation to a specific person of interest. The note demanded $118,000, almost identical to the Christmas bonus John Ramsey had recently received from Access Graphics. That figure was not a round number or a guess. It corresponded to specific private compensation information that most people in Boulder would have had no way of knowing. For investigators examining the person now identified through genealogy, establishing whether he had any access to that financial information through professional connections or social relationships or some form of research or surveillance conducted before Christmas night, is part of the ongoing work. The note was written on household materials with a household pen that was replaced in its holder after use, suggesting someone comfortable enough in the space not to be rushing out. These details need to fit a specific person before any prosecution can proceed. There is also the question of the pineapple that has never been satisfactorily resolved by any theory of the case. Undigested pineapple was found during the forensic examination, indicating consumption approximately 1 to 2 hours before death. Both John and Patsy Ramsey stated they had not given JonBenét pineapple that night, that she had fallen asleep on the way home and been put directly to bed. A bowl of pineapple with milk was found on the kitchen table with fingerprints belonging to Patsy and Burke, not JonBenét. The simplest explanations are that JonBenét came downstairs after being put to bed and helped herself, or that Patsy or Burke gave her some without the memory surviving the trauma of what followed. In the context of the intruder theory, the pineapple raises the possibility that there was some period of interaction between JonBenét and whoever was responsible, possibly in or near the kitchen, before events moved to the basement. Whatever the current investigation ultimately advances as its account of what happened that night, the pineapple is a detail that needs explaining. The investigation as it stands in 2026 is, by the assessment of people who have followed it for decades, in a genuinely different place than it has been at any previous moment. Not a better place in the sense of certainty, but a more specific place in the sense of having something that has never existed before. A specific individual to investigate, a person identified through the same scientific method that cracked the Golden State Killer case. A person whose presence in the evidence, if the DNA is what the district attorney's office believes it is, would transform this from an unsolved mystery into a prosecutable case with a named defendant. John Ramsey, now 81 years old, has estimated publicly that he believes there is a 70 to 80% chance the current testing and genealogy work will produce a breakthrough. He has met with investigators. He has pushed for every available technology to be brought to the evidence. He has spent 30 years watching an investigation that he believes spent too many of those years looking in the wrong direction, and he has continued to advocate for the approach that has finally produced a specific investigative lead. He wants the case resolved while he is still alive to see it. He wants his family's name fully and formally cleared. He wants justice for JonBenét. Patsy Ramsey cannot see any of this. She died in 2006. She spent a decade being publicly suspected of being responsible for her daughter's death. She died without the exoneration letter that arrived 2 years after her passing. She died without the genealogy work that identified a person of interest 20 years later. She died without justice for her daughter, without vindication for herself, and without any of the resolution she spent her last years hoping would come. Whatever the current investigation ultimately produces, that outcome arrives too late for the woman who had perhaps the most at stake in it, and JonBenét herself. She would be 35 years old today if she had lived. She loved to perform. She loved her family. She had, by every account of people who knew her, a warmth that made people remember her. She was a child with a Christmas morning and a favorite bike and a future that was stolen. What happened to her was a crime committed by a person who has spent 30 years without accountability while the wrong people were investigated and accused. If the current work succeeds, if the evidence leads where investigators believe it is pointing, accountability may finally be possible. If it does not succeed, if the challenges of building a case nearly 3 decades after the crime prove insurmountable, despite having a specific person of interest, then JonBenét joins the long and painful list of victims whose cases the justice system could not close despite evidence pointing toward a responsible party. The investigation continues. The technology that produced the person of interest has already changed what is possible in cold case investigation. The science is better than it has ever been. The investigators working this case are more focused than they have been in years, and the DNA profile that was invisible to the human eye, collected in the first days of this investigation, entered into databases that couldn't identify it for decades, and then applied to genealogy methods that produced a specific lead for the first time in 30 years, has finally told investigators something concrete, something that required patience and technological development and the refusal to accept permanent failure. The question the DNA has been asking since 1997 is still asking itself. But for the first time, the investigation may have something that looks like an answer. If this investigation has given you something to think about, if you believe cases like this deserve careful evidence-based analysis that honors the victims and respects the complexity of the truth, subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit the notification bell so you are there when new developments in this case are reported. Leave a comment below with your assessment of where this investigation is heading and what you think the current evidence actually establishes. Share this video with anyone who has followed this case and deserves to know where it stands in 2026. These are real people, a real family, a real child whose life was taken. They deserve our attention, our respect, and our commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how long that takes.